So just to let you know, I will really follow the structure of this kind of policy note. So first, as Ursula said, what can we even understand as authoritarian regime so that we have some guidance on that? Then secondly, we're going to discuss a little bit the approach. What is SDC doing at the moment? What are the entry points in different kinds of regimes? And the third element is on management considerations. So about the conceptual framework. And this is actually based also on work that IDS did do for us, some kind of more academic work that they did for us. Thank you very much, Miguel, who is also present here. So we think that it's best, or for our purposes, what is interesting is to understand authoritarian regimes in two dimensions. So below you have the democratization dimension, where we really talk about, these more institutionalized aspects of a democracy. How can you participate, in what kind of way, are there elections, and all these kinds of different elements. So more this kind of institutionalized ways of actually shaping public opinion. And then we have the liberalization aspect, so the second axis, where it's really more about, if you have these possibilities, and hopefully they're not just facade possibilities, who can actually use them? In Switzerland, we would have been great on the democratization dimension, but until the 70s, there was not really a right to vote for women. So it's really also about, on the one hand, how can we use these kind of different political instruments, and to whom is it open? What is the civic space openness to actually use instruments that are in place? So this is how we try to understand also authoritarianism. When we have these two different dimensions, we can have four different kinds of regime types that we can look at. So down below, you have the autocracies, where really the thing is that sometimes decision-making is very opaque. You have a regime, and then maybe you have concentric circles of power around them. And it's very difficult also to find out how decision-making is made. And it's very difficult actually to even take part in this kind of decision making about public issues. So it's really a maintenance of a regime that wants to be there in power. If we then move up to the yellow dove, actually, we talk about liberalized autocracies. And there, the main feature is really also that we still have somehow a controlled space. So we have a regime that wants to control space still, but it allows a little bit of plurality. So there is some kind of plural or more people that can actually take part in political decision making. So it's a little bit broader, but the regime kind of plays a little bit with this. You can sometimes it leaves more open than less open, and it's also not so clear what is actually possible and what is not. So depending also on a little bit opportunistic opinions of the regime, maybe the space is a little bit larger and then less large in terms of what is allowed. When we go further to the right, we have limited political democracies. So here the thing is that the political and civil space has expanded, so more people can actually participate. It's broader, but there is still some kind of discrimination around ethnic or maybe other group-oriented kind of identities, which is happening. And then finally, we have political democracies where we really have to rule by many with checks and balances and all of these different kinds of things. So this is how we can try to understand in what kind of regime are we actually organizing ourselves. So now what I would like to do is really go to this kind of second chapter, also that you see in the policy note. It is about what do these kind of more academic or conceptual considerations now mean for SDC? And how do we try to work in these four different kind of environments? We start with the autocracy, and I think the interesting thing when looking at what is also the relevance of the data that we have on different regime types is that there is no linear development, and maybe this is a little bit misleading now with my arrows or with the arrows that we have placed here, because we are still kind of saying, yeah, maybe you go from an autocracy, then to the next level, and then to a democracy. But it is really like this, that there is no linear either development or also no linear decline. So sometimes, there can be a decline from a fully fledged democracy right into an autocracy, which is quite more seldom. But there are no linear paths here. I think that is really important to say. And what is maybe most dangerous is, and particularly with the backsliding that we see right now, is that there are these kind of declines that are very one step after the other. So one can think one is in a normalization of looking at these things, so that all of these declines that are happening are more seen as a normal kind of path. And then we think that maybe this is also something of the most kind of dangerous things, because there is this gradual decline, also backsliding in more authoritarian regimes. When we really have fully fledged autocracies, it's interesting to see that SDC oftentimes goes more into a direction of integrating governance in sectors. So not so much working on governance programs per se as a sector, but rather looking at this transversal governance, as we call it within SDC. So really looking, how can we support governance aspect in sectors, in health sector, in education, in the water sector, and to kind of build up these more kind of spaces within the sector. Then the second thing is, and we were just talking with Mariam from Mali before, the second thing is that in autocracies, trust is so low that we think also to support these spaces for dialogue is really central. Wherever there is a possibility to support dialogue and support trust building between the state and the citizens, it is something that should be supported. And the third thing, which is interesting, because we are also the network that pushes decentralization and local governance, but we think it's important to be a little bit careful with going local in fully fledged autocracies, because sometimes this kind of hierarchical structure and the power structure goes down to the very low level. So sometimes even this going local might not prove to be a very good kind of reaction. There are some risks connected to this, fungibility and also legitimizing regime. But you can also read this in the document. I think it's important to say, these are models, so it's not like set in stone. These are also proposition and possible entry points. Things might not work in all countries in the same way. When we move from this more kind of full autocracy to a more liberalized autocracy, where we have a civic space, the civic space, not the political space, but the civic space that is maybe a little bit more open, we think we have different possibilities also at the local level. So we think there is a possibility to kind of try out a more democratic approach, a more participatory approach at the local level, and somehow use this then to show what kind of good results can come from a participatory and accountable and transparent approach at the local level, also for the national level. And then, so the encouragement of a broad and diverse participation that goes actually together. So it's really not just, participation of the citizens, but also within their kind of business associations or with different kinds of organizations, that this can be strengthened, which is also a little bit outside of the political realm, but to kind of have this possibility of associations that are strengthened already in this kind of limited space that we have. Then the development of the CSO landscape, where it might be possible to really start and support them with trainings and capacity building in a manner that is kind of strengthening them in very small steps, and supporting also them in particularly what comes next, social accountability, that there is this possibility, not in a political way, but more like with citizen scorecards or other things, and not in a political manner, to kind of really demand accountability from also government. And here, this is kind of a in-between thingy, which is not in the, so you have to pay attention, because it's not in the policy note. It is from the Democracy Report 2020 from VDEM. And what is really interesting here, and Melina pointed this out also to us because she was working on media very strongly, is that when you see it here very interestingly for Serbia. So what we see is that before there is kind of this black line, the dotted or black line, is elections, free and fair elections. So what is interesting is that you see that media are going down strongly before, afterwards the elections are going down. So this is very interesting indicator also more when you don't think in terms of progress, but in terms of backsliding. So, you know, the freedom of kind of CSOs or media or academia goes back, and then afterwards all of the democratic elements follow, which is kind of an interesting observation. And it can be kind of as an early warning sign also when you are, for example, in a limited political democracy, it can be a very strong kind of warning sign when this happens, that possibly other elements are following afterwards. So we're already with the limited political democracy. Here, we think we can go further also in pushing more elements of democratization. So it's about the diversification of power centers, particularly also strengthening this localizing agenda even further, looking more, not so much into participation elements, but rather looking into, you know, fiscal decentralization, what kind of powers and responsibilities are at the different levels. So really to try much harder and push there that this is going to be strengthened. Then an encompassing accountability system. So really going from social accountability, which is still important, to more political accountability, where also these political aspects are strengthened and where accountability is demanded from political actors. And then the diversification of civil society actors, where one can even try also to be more systemic in the way how civil society actors are supported, meaning maybe through core funding, where really the overall system of the civil society is supported as a system and not just some different civil society organizations. You have a lot more detail in the brief, but we want really to have some space for discussion. So I'm going through it really, really quickly. I'm sorry. And then finally, the political democracies. Here, we think that it's really important to place also a strong element of checks and balances, really looking at, you know, how is the judiciary also coming into play together, and that they can also oversee the executive, the parliament that is coming in, strengthening the parliament. And this is kind of really also the second point, looking at more supporting political pluralism. So we think that here we are in a situation where we even can start to think about supporting elections, supporting political parties, supporting this more kind of political actors that are in the democratic system.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's doing something with SDC is always a bit of a homecoming. I saw already a number of names in the chat box that are familiar, and I'm sure there's more participating that I know of, that I've met over the past years. Well, first of all, let me say that this policy note, from our perspective, the perspective of the OECD governance network, is a very, very timely initiative. I think I don't have full information, of course, but as far as I know, SDC is the second country after the US that produces a specific policy guidance for working in authoritarian contexts. So in that sense, you're certainly still ahead of the pack and a bit of a front runner. So a very interesting learning curve, I'm sure, that will come out of this. Now, the OECD Governance Network, where I sit, and which was, by the way, until last Tuesday, co-chaired by Switzerland for the past 3 years, started discussing governance support in authoritarian contexts about a year ago in the plenary meetings. And this is motivated, the interest is motivated by two facts. One is there's plenty of reports, indicator sets that signal a clear trend towards more authoritarian governance worldwide. Not only in our partner countries, but also in some of the OECD member countries. So there's the ones that have the handle on aid. Now, the other element of that is that, as I think Ursula indicated already, there's an increasing volume of international assistance that is spent in autocratic regimes. If we take the VDEM classification of regimes, they have two types of autocracies, closed autocracies and electoral autocracies. If we take the list of those two countries together, then 2/3 of all official development assistance is spent in autocratic regimes over the past 10 years. If we zoom in on governance support more particularly, then over the past 10 years, the governance support in closed autocracies, so the most authoritarian regimes, increased from 3% of total ODA, total assistance, to 16%. So times 5 over 10 years. So we have more activities. There's more authoritarian regimes, and we have more activities in authoritarian regimes. So there's a kind of learning to do in how we deal with those regimes. Now, I'll make a few comments on the conceptual approach that SDC is taking. A few comments also on the entry points that were highlighted in the previous presentation. And then a closing remark. On the conceptual approach, I understand the logic of the two variables, liberalization and democratization. And out of that comes a model of 4 regime types that was just presented, which is quite similar to other existing models like the Economist Intelligence Unit, but also certainly the VDEM regimes of the world, and you use VDEM data. So I understand the logic that you followed with those 2 variables, and that makes sense, but I also see advantages in adopting an existing model of regime classification. And that's maybe a bit self-interest from our side, because we do have some interest in a certain level of standardization of the conversation that facilitates exchange at international level and between countries. And if the regime classification systems multiply, it doesn't always facilitate the conversations. Now, I'm the first one to acknowledge that any of those models and any of those systems have flaws, and you will always have, you ask the question, do you see your country rightly placed? You will always have varying opinions on it should be more liberal, it should be more or less democratic, etc. And if I look at the VDEM classification, I also wonder why, for example, Guinea-Bissau is placed way above a number of other countries, and yet it is a very or highly failed state. So that's certainly true, but there is some merit, I think, in adopting an existing system. Also because some of these systems, like the VDEM regimes of the world, have strong theoretical underpinnings and have a massive amount of data, all those indices that are linked to it and that can facilitate the analysis that you have to do in each of your countries. And of course, the quantitative analysis is only a part of the picture. We all know that, but there it is available. So I wasn't very sure of the added value of having another 4 regime type model that would be used. Now, a second point I would like to make is we all like to categorize things because it facilitates our thinking. But some of the remarks in the chat box also indicated it, and there was also a slide on that. The categorizing tends to fix the definition of a certain regime or the status of a certain regime. And yet it is very, very important to look at the trends, the trajectories, and what's the direction of travel of a certain regime. And if we look at the countries that where you are working, then you can see that in each of the categories, authoritarian, there's and up. There's countries that are on a positive trajectory. In the autocracies, we have Somalia, for example, considered to improve on a number of indicators. Jordan in the liberalized autocracies, Moldova in the limited political democracies, Tunisia in political democracies. But in each of those categories, you also have countries that are on a negative trajectory. Bangladesh was already mentioned, and also by someone in the chat box. Serbia in the liberal autocracies, Bolivia in limited political democracies, Burkina Faso in political democracies. So that maybe makes that if a country is on a positive or a negative, a progressive or a regressive trajectory, that I think has to define to some extent the tactics that you use and the entry points that you use, so that they are not static for a certain category of regime or certain type of regime, but more linked also to the trajectory on which a country is. And that an additional point to that is that I've had the pleasure and pain of working on governance for the past 20 plus years. We had a first, from the mid-90s until 2000, 2005, were years of booming, and it was all about democracy promotion and advancing on that continuum from more closed autocratic regimes to more democratic regimes. All our thinking is on that continuum, and that still is a bit reflected, I think, in the policy note also. I think if the explanation of each regime types starts then with, okay, you can continue to do what you did in the previous regime type, but you can add on A, B, and C. So it's a kind of cumulative continuum. But what we see right now, and that was the reality during many years, but what we see now for the past 10 years or so, is that there's this increasing regressive trend. And that is actually something new and maybe requires a different mindset. It's like in football, either you play offensive and you promote, or you play defensive. It's different tactics. You need different skills and maybe different instruments to address. And I think we probably haven't done, and that's a task also for the governance network, we haven't thought through sufficiently what a defense strategy looks like. We promote free media and have programs to support that, etc. But what do we do when media gets restricted? What does that mean for our intervention? Do we need to do different things? Do we need to double down on our efforts? So that the defensive question, I think, needs to be still fleshed out much more. Now that brings me to the entry points, and I think it's nicely laid out in the four regime types, with, to a certain extent, this cumulative logic that I refer to. And so the more liberal and democratic regimes get, the more options for support we have, is a bit what I think transpires from the policy note. That doesn't align entirely with some other research. In 2018, VDEM published a paper on the effectiveness of democracy support in each or in regime types, different regime types. They actually concluded that the level of threat democracy support poses to a regime and the democratic deficiencies, those two variables, are the ones that determine the effectiveness of democracy support. So they found that democracy support, that means in practice, in this particular case for this study, support to civil society, support to media, support to elections, and support to human rights. That this was most effective during regime transitions, countries where the regime type is not entirely defined, post-conflict or something. So there's a kind of regime vacuum, and there democracy support along those four entry points worked very well. In closed autocracies and in electoral democracy, so the two extremes of the regime type spectrum that they use, they found that democracy support had very little effect in the first instance because it poses a threat to the regime, so they don't want it, they don't let it. And we have data now also to back that up. This is ongoing research that we are doing in the governance network, and that will still be further developed. But if we look at the governance support in closed autocracies, we see that over the past 10 years, if we divide it a bit up between state building, and that is support to public financial management, domestic resource mobilization, decentralization, etc. That kind of stuff. And the democracy support, the things that I mentioned, civil society, media, elections, human rights. If we divide it in those two building blocks, then we see that the proportion of state building support in closed autocracies has increased from 56%, if I'm not mistaken, to over 80%, 88, I think it is now, over the past 10 years. So in closed autocracies, we invest a lot in state building. Now the question is, or yeah, we can say this is for evident reasons, because it's difficult to do democracy support in those regime circumstances. But we also need to ask the question then maybe, with the state building support that we give, are we not strengthening autocratic regimes and make autocratic states even stronger? So again, this is still ongoing. There's no solid evidence on the negative or the positive side for the moment, but these are also lines that we are looking at to understand the implications of our support in different regime types. So there's still a lot of learning to be done on this, but I think we need to try to still get a bit out of this progressive improvement, linear kind of thinking. And we've mentioned, it's been mentioned that it doesn't work that way, etc. But still, it is a bit in the DNA of our thinking. That's for the entry points. On the management aspect, I have not much to add. The only thing maybe, I think the policy note doesn't say anything about funding pressure, disbursement pressure, and for as much as we can do excellent political economy analysis, and take care of our staff, etc. We know in reality that this is also a very strong incentive for us. So independent from how the regime type is evolving, we do have that pressure to show that we are spending the money and we don't want to lose it. We don't want to give it to our colleague in another country, etc. So, and that is a very real factor that determines our action to a large extent. And another thing on the management, I think, is that it would be really, really interesting to have very regular feedback loops on how this policy note is rolled out, and certainly something or learning that if that can be fed into the multilateral platforms like the governance network, there will be great interest in this. Thank you for listening to me, and again, congratulations with the initiative.
So I mean, the way that we started, and Mark has a point. I mean, there's so many. There's Polity 4, there's the VDEM, there's the Freedom House. There's so many indices and typologies that that we don't know which one to start with. And what we did was we went to what we already know for the past 40 or 50 years. And this is actually not a new typology. This is 40 years old. This was Guillermo O'Donnell with Philip Schmitter in the late 70s, early 80s, when they were looking at Latin America and Southern Europe on how did the democratic transitions happen at that in this space. And Guillermo O'Donnell Schmitter, talking with Albert Hirschman, Robert Dahl, Przeworski, all the big names of political science, they come up with this typology, which we've simplified it here, of, okay, how do we know, or what do we know when countries try to become popular democracies or polyarchies, like Dahl calls them. And there's many other levels further up in terms of, you have social democracies, welfare democracies, there's loads and loads of types. So the interesting thing was kind of use this as a typology, which is, again, as I say, a 40-year-old typology, because this is the basis of VDEM. This is the basis of a lot of work that we have on let's call them non-democracies. So that's kind of one side of where is this coming from. And Ursula asked me, why is this framework interesting? And the interesting part, like Mark mentioned, like Philippe mentioned before as well, is not where the countries are, is the trends, is where are they coming from? Have they tasted democracy before or not? Where are they going, more or less? The other interesting thing we notice is regional comparisons. A lot of the literature tells us that these things, these processes of backsliding or going up and down, left and right, countries don't do it on their own. It's a neighborhood thing to a certain extent. So it's really interesting is to see where the countries are coming from, where they're going. And that was quite interesting because a lot of the literature these days, the big one, is talking about the democratic backslide. And the first thing we noticed, because we started looking at certain African countries, was that, well, we can't talk about democratic backslide in countries that were never democracies, that were never political democracies. So then we need to think of other things, because, you know, the way that the hardliners, the softliners, the way that civil society organizations and actors operate is completely different if the country was a political democracy before or not, and it's kind of moving downwards or left or right. So that was one important thing. The other one is that we tend to kind of think a lot about democratization, and there was the big moves of democratization around the world in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. But the liberalization, and this is a particular kind of liberalization, we're talking about political liberalization, the freedoms, the inclusiveness is something that we don't necessarily pay attention to. We focus too much on the competition, on the contestation, and it's these two axes that I think makes it really interesting to look at. And then we're lucky enough that VDEM exists, and they have 100 years worth of data for most countries in the world, and they have lots of indices that we can use to kind of populate the countries, but also Andrea was hinting that, we have more diagrams for different regions and different countries. And this is the interesting thing, is when we see countries like, for instance, Colombia, going from a liberalized autocracy to becoming an autocracy, then going up again in the 60s, and then moving towards a limited political democracy, and going up and down. That's what makes it interesting for us when we're doing the analysis, when we're doing our political economy analysis of what are the histories of the different regimes and who are the people, who are these actors that are pushing up and down and left and right.